The lights in the sold-out arena burned bright, casting long shadows over the octagon as the energy of the crowd pulsed like an unrelenting wave. Every seat was filled, yet the air felt thick with a collective breath being held. Thousands of eyes locked on the cage, where two men stood on opposite ends, two warriors, two forces of nature, about to collide. Conor McGregor, the name that needed no introduction, a storm wrapped in human form, a man who had built his legend on precision, power, and an almost otherworldly ability to predict his opponent's every move. Across from him, the enigma Sharapudtin, a fighter whose name had only recently begun to spread like wildfire, carrying whispers of something different, something dangerous. He wasn't just another challenger. He was a question mark, a threat wrapped in silence, a presence that seemed to warp the very air around him. From the moment the fight was announced, speculation ignited like dry grass meeting a flame. Sharaputtin's record was impeccable, but his methods were an unsolved puzzle. No leaked footage, no training camp interviews, no bravado-filled press conferences, just the eerie quiet of a fighter who let his reputation speak louder than words. McGregor, ever the showman, had tried to break that silence, throwing verbal jabs, pushing buttons, searching for a crack. But Sharaputtin never bit. He stared through him, an expression unreadable, as if he was already standing in a place beyond words, beyond mind games. And that was what unsettled people the most, not fear, not arrogance, but the unknown. As the ref stepped forward, giving final instructions, a hush fell over the crowd, a strange contrast to the electric chaos just moments before. Every movement in the cage felt magnified, every glance carrying weight. McGregor bounced on the balls of his feet, his signature swagger still intact, but there was something different in his eyes tonight, something calculating, cautious. Sharaputtin stood motionless, his stance relaxed yet unnervingly stable, as if rooted to the very foundation of the octagon itself. The moment the bell rang, the air itself seemed to tighten, the world shrinking down to that 30-foot battleground where only one would emerge victorious. McGregor moved first, a sharp feint followed by a lightning-quick left, the kind of strike that had dropped giants in the past. But Sharaputtin's response was unsettling. He didn't evade, didn't flinch. He adjusted his weight just slightly, letting the punch glance past him by mere inches, his eyes locked onto McGregor's with something that wasn't surprise, wasn't relief, just understanding. It was as if he had seen it before, as if he had already lived this moment and was merely watching it unfold again. The crowd erupted, half in awe, half in disbelief. For the first time in years, McGregor found himself second-guessing. Not because his opponent was faster, not because he was stronger, but because he wasn't reacting the way people were supposed to. Fighters either rushed forward or played it safe. They calculated or they brawled. But Sharaputtin was doing something else entirely. He was waiting, not in hesitation, but in certainty, as if he knew the exact moment McGregor would step too close, the exact fraction of a second when his balance would be off by just enough. A bead of sweat rolled down McGregor's temple, but it wasn't from exhaustion, it was from something deeper. He feinted again, testing, searching for a read, for a tell. Sharaputtin gave him none. Then, without warning, he struck. It wasn't a wild flurry, wasn't a desperate counter. It was one strike, perfectly placed, launched with the precision of a marksman pulling a trigger. McGregor's head snapped back, and for the first time in a long time, the world saw something they weren't used to seeing. Not confidence, not bravado, but genuine shock. The arena roared as McGregor stumbled back, recalibrating, adjusting. But in the silence between the noise, one thought cut through his mind like a blade. This wasn't just another fight. This was something different. something he hadn't prepared for. And as he locked eyes with Sharapudtin once more, he saw at the faintest flicker of something in his opponent's expression, not arrogance, not aggression, but inevitability. The moment stretched longer than it should have, but not because McGregor hesitated. He never hesitated. It was something else, something deeper, a gnawing realization creeping into the edges of his thoughts. He had been here before, against Aldo, against Diaz, against Khabib, facing men who wanted to break him, men who had either underestimated him or sought to dismantle his will. But this was different. Sharapudtin wasn't looking to break him, wasn't even trying to prove a point. The way he stood there, still as stone, it was as if he was fulfilling something inevitable, something that had already been decided long before the first bell. McGregor shook the thought away and reset his stance, rolling his shoulders, forcing his mind back into the fight. The sting of the strike still lingered, a sharp, precise touch rather than a brutal blow, but one that carried an unsettling message. He had been hit before, hit harder, but this wasn't about power. It was about control. It was about a fighter who seemed to see not just the movements in the cage, but the rhythm behind them, the very fabric of time that dictated them. And that was more dangerous than raw strength. Outside the cage, whispers had already begun to spread. Analysts and commentators scrambled to dissect the moment, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. In McGregor's corner, his team called out instructions, their voices edged with something that hadn't been there before: concern. They had watched him dominate for years, had seen him turn doubters into believers with nothing but precision and confidence. But this wasn't the usual dance, wasn't the usual game of chess where he dictated the pace. This time, it felt as though he had stepped into something much larger than himself, something that had been waiting for him all along. Sharaputtin's origins remained an enigma, a ghost story that had begun circulating in the fight world with no clear source. No interviews, no personal details, just stories. Some claimed he had trained in complete isolation, away from the distractions of fame, perfecting his craft in ways that bordered on obsession. Others whispered about his uncanny ability to adapt mid-fight, to absorb techniques like a sponge, making him nearly impossible to prepare for. And then there were the darker theories, the ones no one dared say out loud, but lingered in the minds of those who had watched his fights. The eerie precision, the calm that never broke, the sense that he was always just a step ahead, not by instinct alone, but by something else entirely. As the seconds bled into each other, McGregor's mind raced through possibilities. He needed to shift the momentum, needed to do something that would force Sharapudtin into unfamiliar territory. If his opponent was reading him like a book, he had to tear out the pages, rewrite the story. He feinted left but exploded to the right, launching a spinning kick that had folded many before. The crowd surged as the strike cut through the air with perfect speed, perfect timing, only for Sharaputtin to slip just beyond its reach. Eyes locked onto McGregor as if he had seen it coming before the thought had even formed. For the first time, doubt crept into McGregor's chest, an unfamiliar weight pressing down. Not because of the evasion itself. Fighters avoided strikes all the time. But because of the way Sharapudtin did it, as if he was walking through a memory rather than reacting in real time. The crowd saw it too. The roars grew louder, but there was a shift in their tone, an undercurrent of disbelief. Something strange was happening, something that no one, not even McGregor himself, fully understood. In the locker rooms, fighters gathered around screens, watching in silence. Some clenched their fists, others leaned in closer, eyes narrowed as they analyzed every movement. They had all seen McGregor handle pressure before, seen him adapt to chaos and come out the other side victorious. But this wasn't chaos. This was something chilling in its simplicity. Sharaputtin wasn't overpowering him. He wasn't overwhelming him with speed or aggression. He was doing something far worse. He was making him doubt himself. Back inside the cage, McGregor's jaw tightened. He had built his career on defying expectations, on proving the world wrong over and over again. And he wasn't about to stop now. He adjusted his stance, tightened his guard, and took a slow step forward, eyes locked onto Sharaputtin. If there was a secret to his opponent's strategy, he would find it. If there was a weakness in his game, he would expose it. And if Sharaputtin truly believed he was untouchable, McGregor would be the one to remind him that no one was invincible. But as the next exchange began, something else became clear. Sharaputtin wasn't just reading McGregor's movements. He was waiting for something. And as the moment unfolded, as the tension in the air thickened to the point of suffocation, the world began to realize that whatever was coming next, it wouldn't just change the fight. It would change everything. The rhythm of the fight shifted, but not in the way anyone expected. McGregor had been here before, facing men who came forward with reckless power or retreated under the weight of his pressure. But Sharaputtin did neither. He remained eerily still, his body carrying the same quiet tension as a predator that knew exactly when to strike. For every step McGregor took, there was no immediate response, no counterfeint, no visible preparation, just an unshakable presence that made the octagon feel smaller, as if the walls were closing in around him. McGregor tested again, launching a crisp combination jab, cross, lead hook. They weren't meant to finish the fight, just to draw something out, force Sharaputtin to reveal a pattern, a weakness. But the strikes never connected. Sharaputtin moved as if he had already seen them play out in slow motion, his head shifting just out of range, his feet adjusting with mechanical precision. It wasn't defensive, it was predictive. And for the first time in McGregor's career, he felt like he was fighting against something that had already happened. The crowd, once wild with adrenaline, had grown quieter, their cheers dipping into murmurs of uncertainty. This wasn't just a fight anymore. It was something different, something unsettling. The people watching weren't sure what they were witnessing, only that it felt wrong. Even the commentators, trained to dissect every frame, struggled to explain what they were seeing. "McGregor is missing by inches," one of them said, his voice laced with confusion. "And it's not just head movement. Sharaputtin is moving before the punches even come. It's like he knows." And then, as if responding to the words themselves, Sharaputtin struck. It wasn't an overhand right, not a textbook counter. It was something else entirely. A single step forward, a shift in weight, and a sharp, almost surgical strike to McGregor's ribs. Not enough to drop him, not enough to make the highlight reels, but enough to send a message. McGregor stumbled back, blinking as his breath hitched for half a second, just long enough for a sliver of doubt to slip in. It was in that moment that everything changed. Outside the cage, in the deepest corners of the fight world, men who had seen it all sat frozen in front of their screens, their expressions unreadable. Former champions, hardened analysts, people who had spent their lives studying the fight game watched in stunned silence, seeing something they couldn't explain. It wasn't just skill, wasn't just talent. It was something else entirely. And one by one, they all found themselves wondering the same thing. Had they seen this before? McGregor adjusted, forcing himself to ignore the nagging sense that something was off. He had made a career out of adapting, out of finding angles others couldn't see. Whatever game Sharaputtin was playing, he would break through it. He had to. With a deep breath, He pushed forward again, this time launching a deceptive step through left, a move that had dropped some of the best in the world. But before his foot had even planted, before the strike had even fully formed, Sharapudtin was already moving, not in reaction, but in anticipation. And that was when the realization hit. McGregor wasn't fighting someone who was reacting faster than him. He wasn't fighting someone with better timing. He was fighting someone who was moving before the moment even arrived. The crowd didn't know it yet, but McGregor did. And for the first time in his career, a thought crossed his mind that had never been there before. What if he wasn't supposed to win this fight? A cold realization settled into McGregor's chest, heavier than any strike he had ever taken. He had faced power before, had felt the weight of bone colliding with flesh, the sting of a perfectly placed shot. But this was different. This was something else entirely. The way Sharapudtin moved, the way he seemed to slip through time itself, left only one explanation. He wasn't just reading McGregor. He was ahead of him, operating seconds into the future, while the rest of the world remained trapped in the present. McGregor's body knew what to do before his mind did. Years of instinct, of muscle memory, kicked in, and he exploded forward, launching a calculated assault. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about disrupting the rhythm, forcing chaos into a fight that had become eerily predictable. He threw feints where he normally struck, held back when he normally pressed forward. He abandoned precision for raw, unpredictable violence. And for a moment, just a moment, it seemed to work. Sharaputtin's movements grew less fluid, a microsecond slower, as if the pattern had been shaken. Then everything shifted. Sharaputtin's stance adjusted, his feet planting with the weight of inevitability. His eyes, calm and unwavering, met McGregor's, and something unspoken passed between them. A quiet understanding. A truth that had always been there, waiting to be realized. This wasn't a fight. McGregor was meant to win, not because he lacked skill, not because he wasn't good enough, but because it had already happened. It had already been decided. The final strike came so fast that the audience barely saw it. A step, a twist, a sharp, precise motion that bypassed every layer of defense. McGregor felt the impact before he saw it, his body folding, the world tilting sideways. He hit the canvas, but the pain wasn't what stood out, it was the silence. The crowd, the commentary team, his own corner, everything had fallen into a strange, stunned quiet, as if the entire arena had been momentarily ripped out of time. Sharapudtin didn't follow up. He didn't pounce for a finish. He simply stepped back, watching as the referee moved in. The fight was over, but the weight of it lingered, something beyond victory or defeat. McGregor lay there for a moment, staring up at the bright arena lights, his breath coming in steady, measured draws. He had been beaten before, but this was something else. This felt like stepping into a story that had already been written, playing out a script he had never seen but had somehow been following all along. As he sat up, eyes locking onto his opponent one last time, the question burned at the edges of his mind. Who was Sharapudtin? What was he? But deep down, some part of him already knew. Sharapudtin gave him the slightest nod, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the noise of the arena. And as the moment settled, as the reality of what had just happened set in, a single thought cut through the haze. This wasn't the first time this fight had happened. And it wouldn't be the last.